To Fáilte, Mór, Riv, Alagan and you're all extremely welcome today. It's fabulous to see so many people here for this workshop this morning. My name's Sarah Boyce. I work with PPR. I'm an organiser with the New Script for Mental Health campaign. I'm just going to say a few words to begin with to give you a bit of a background to this workshop, and then we have a few people to speak before we hand over to Dr. Lucy Johnstone, who's going to run the workshop. So everybody's very, very welcome. If you haven't been to Conway Mill before, it's a fantastic building. It's just such a fabulous resource. I was looking it up this morning, 1842. It's a flax mill. It dated back to then. And, you know, over the last almost 2 centuries, lots of changes. And from the 90s, there was a huge renovation work undertaken for this building, and it's now a community resource, and there are artists in it and innovation hubs, all sorts of things, and it's a facility for us to come together in. So and they're so welcoming in here in Conway Mill as well. It's fabulous. So the workshop this morning is part of Féile na gCloigini Gorma. You'll see a few of us going around in the yellow t-shirts, and that's a week-long community festival happening here in West Belfast, up in the Upper Springfield. And the strapline for that festival is community, solidarity and well-being. And I'll say a wee bit more about the festival in a minute, but first of all, just to tell you about where this workshop has come from. So it's been jointly organised by Glór na Móna, which is an Irish language, medium, youth and community organisation, and ourselves in New Script for Mental Health. New Script for Mental Health is a region-wide across the north, across the 5 trusts, and it's a movement, a rights-based movement, a human rights-based movement, to do what the title says, a new script for mental health. So what we're doing is trying to open up space to bring people together to have conversations. Everybody knows that the current approach isn't serving anybody. It's not working. It hasn't worked, not just here, but internationally. And it's about looking, you know, if that isn't working, what could be better? And that's where the genesis of the conversations came from. The campaign is led by individuals and families, many of whom have been dreadfully harmed by mental health services, including loss of loved ones, but also people working in mental health services who are also experiencing harm from a system, you know, vicarious trauma, moral injury. So coming together, knowing that there's a radical shift needed. So that's what the campaign is about. And our values, very similar to the festival, are community, compassion, connection, and choice. And that they're very, very important. Our values underpin everything we do, because it's a broad-based movement. But if people want to get involved, and we'd really encourage everybody here today, make sure to leave your email address at the registration desk. Some people, it was busy and didn't get a chance. So at the break, if you want to be on our mailing list, all choice, please leave your email with us, so you'll find out what's happening. I mentioned about Glór na Móna. It's an amazing Irish language, medium, youth and community work. They're doing real cutting edge work, and they're dedicated to enhancing health and well-being through participation and solidarity. And like us, they're trying to, very much in an organic way, open up space to have conversations and to think critically about how, as communities, we can self-organise and develop alternative ideas that are about challenging inequality and the denial of dignity to people who need it most. So just to come back to the festival, Féile na gCloigini Gorma, it's a week-long community festival established back, this is the 7th year, I think, established in 2017, and from Little Acorns, established up in the Upper Springfield by the community up there, because it was a period, as we know, still is, you know, a very, very harsh period of severe austerity, deepening poverty, and a worsening mental health crisis. And community organisers in that community, in this broad community, were saying for communities that suffered the most during the conflict, they received the least from the peace dividend, the so-called peace dividend. So the festival was about lifting people's spirits, raising people's spirits and the morale at a community level, a collective level, by creating spaces for connection, participation and collaboration. They took as their logo the bluebells. I'm not pointing to my chest here in case people think I'm trying to draw attention. This is their bluebells. Féile na gCloigini Gorma in Irish. The festival of the bluebells, and took that as their symbol to remind all of us about the joy of life, despite everything, that the hardship and the real heartaches that people are living with, but that it's and what nature and the environment and the heritage can connect us to that. So it's a unique community festival, and its watchwords, as I said, are community, solidarity and wellbeing. Give you a wee flavour of what's happened so far. Marty, who's going around with the camera, has been doing an incredible job all week. No sooner than an event is over, it's up. It's out on social media, so do have a look, check it out, Féile na gCloigini Gorma. Already this week they've had Sunrise Sea Swim out at Helen's Bay. They had a big festival rally down the White Rock Road. They had a annual Black Mountain walk and run. They had a roundtable discussion and a tree planting ceremony with a delegation from an indigenous riverine and agrarian traditional community from the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. So varied, if nothing else. A film showing on the struggles of fishermen in Gaza. GAA and soccer competitions, book launches, and yesterday there was a wonderful community lunch, a long table lunch up in Newhill Community Centre, with all of the catering provided by asylum seekers who are part of the Kind Economy campaign, who are legally barred from working. So again, connecting people in, that human connection and solidarity. So I'd encourage you to check out the programme, go online if there's programmes here, and talk to people in the blue t-shirts. So that's sort of just a quick run through of ourselves, New Script, and there are lots of activists from New Script here, so at break time do come and talk to us. You'll see our poetry apothecary down on the right hand side. Maura will be down at that, one of our elders in the campaign. And again, it's about words that are strong enough to heal, words strong enough to help. So it's just an alternative to clinical and psychiatric diagnoses and labels, so we're offering that as an option for people as well. So, Gan, what's the expression, Gan? Well, without further ado, in English. So, I would like to invite Dr. Sarah Meakin, who is from the British Psychological Society. She's the chair of the Division of Clinical Psychologists in the North in Northern Ireland here, to come and say a few words, and we're really delighted to have Sarah with us today. So, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's great, we've got the same name, so it's not that hard to remember. So thank you so much for inviting the Division of Clinical Psychology to kind of be here. I'm delighted I've had the privilege of hearing Lucy before, but I'm really looking forward to hearing her again today. So in 2013, the DCP published a position paper which was about the classification of behavioural experience in relation to functional psychiatric diagnosis. And the important part probably of the title really was Time for a Paradigm Shift. And following that really arose the Power Threat Meaning Framework. And Lucy has pioneered that. She is the voice of it, the person who has driven it, probably the person who has been challenged and suffered as a result of it as well. And we really welcome all her work and her continuing push for this framework to be heard. And the number of people in the room today and the passion behind it, I think, really speaks to how it speaks so much to all of us, really, in terms of our experiences and our desire for something better than the system that we currently function within. The framework isn't tied to any kind of level of explanation. This isn't about psychology or psychiatry or social issues, or it is about our experiences. It's not theoretically based. We can fit our models within it if we need to. It has input from people with lived experience and those who support them in it. And at that time, it probably was pioneering in the amount of voices that it had involved within it. Hopefully we do better with that today, but I'm not sure that we're anywhere near where we should be. And it focuses on the distress and not diagnosis. It has been opened a completely new dialogue, and it has not been without controversy and indeed conflict. But nowhere better to have these kind of discussions in Northern Ireland, because we know the importance of conversations and collaborations when we're trying to resolve through conflict. And it offers that potential for new conversations and for new choices as well in understanding ourselves. So it introduces away from what is wrong with you, what's the matter with you, to what happened to you. It ultimately is about encouraging conversations and acknowledging all of our shared humanity and the experiences and the reasonable distress rather than the pathology that we may experience as a result of the experiences that we have. And it gives the option for us to look at choices and ways of helping to understand ourselves and each other as we try to move forward in finding a new conversation, a new way of supporting each other. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm really looking forward to hearing Lucy, but also to hearing everybody else's voices in the room. So I appreciate being asked, and let's have a great day. I'm delighted to be here in Conway Mill. Didn't know you could rent a room, so now on my list of things that I can access in terms of workshops. So thank you very much. Look forward to the day.
Thank you, Sarah. One second. Thank you, Sarah. And just before I ask Dr. Anne Darcy to come up, should have done this earlier, but just a few housekeeping things for people to know. The toilets are down here, so out the door at the bottom, and just keep going round to your right and down at the end of the corridor here. We'll have Dr. Lucy Johnstone will do a presentation, and there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. And then we'll be working in our groups, so it'll be a workshop format. We'll have a break mid-morning, and we will finish at 1 o'clock. But the other thing to say is just the nature of what we're going to be talking about and the discussions, just to be aware of that, and that it may not, it may bring up things for people here, and we don't know, none of us know what maybe, will touch it and bring things up. So just to be mindful of that and do what you need to do during the morning. If people, this is very informal, people do what they need to do to look after themselves. Take some time out with water down at the side there, and if you want to have a chat with any of us, we're here as well, but just wanted to say that, to be aware of that. So to invite Dr. Anne Darcy, who is a clinical psychologist, also an activist, which we're delighted, an activist with New Script for Mental Health and involved with Psychologists for Social Change. But Anne is going to introduce Dr. Lucy Johnstone. Thank you, Anne.
Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here today. And, I am genuinely excited to welcome Dr. Lucy Johnstone here today for what I know will be a fascinating talk. Dr. Lucy Johnstone is a consultant clinical psychologist who has had a significant impact throughout her career, and she is here today to talk about the Power Threat Meaning Framework. She's a lead author of the PTMF, and this has become the most downloaded document in the history of the British Psychological Society. In my role on the Power Threat Meaning Framework Committee, I've been able to see some of the impact that the PTMF is having within healthcare, beyond healthcare, and across the world. And a big thank you to Glór and PPR for bringing us all together today. And I'm really looking forward to the group discussions that we will have later. As a member of Psychologists for Social Change, I've had an opportunity to see some of the fantastic work that Glór and the New Script activists are doing. And I know that the work that Lucy is now going to share with us can support and invigorate the work that is already being done. So I will just hand over to Lucy.
Hi, thank you for those very kind introductions, Sarah and Anne. It's lovely to be here. Can you hear me for a start? Yeah, great. If I become inaudible at any point, please wave your hands around. And
We're going to try and get this sorted, Marty's.
Okay, there's some slightly strange white noise going on behind me, which probably doesn't help with hearing. The other thing I wanted to say was... 1, 2. Ah,
Thank
that's
you, Marty.
a lot better. That's a lot better. Some of you are going to be rather a long way from the slides. Now, it's actually not essential to read every word and every slide because I will talk you through the slides. Some of them are quite dense anyway. Please don't set yourself the task of reading everything on the slides. But if you can't see from the back, which I think you probably can't, then please do feel free to kind of shuffle forward. Okay. So... Oh, do you? Oh, okay. People are having copies. Oh, you've been so well organised. That's brilliant. You can look at your copy in front of you. Fantastic. Okay, so I think this is my 4th visit to Belfast. It's always nice to be back. It's a short hop from Bristol, where I live, so very nice to be here. And very nice to make contact with old friends and new friends. Lovely to be back. And I'm going to introduce you to some ideas today. Can I just have a hands up as who's ever heard of the Power Threat Meaning Framework before that very kind introduction by the second Sarah? Quite a few people. Excellent. That's good. I'm going to start as though no one's heard of it, so to speak. So I'm not going to assume any knowledge. It's nice to hear that the word has spread. Sarah, that was a very, very good summary of an incredibly long document in about a minute and a half, so well done. The only thing I would add to it is that there are 2 lead authors. I'm one of them, and the other one is Professor Mary Boyle. But this has unexpectedly turned into a new stage of my career. I go around the country and indeed around the world talking about the framework. So I'm going to whiz us through the framework. It's going to take us about 3/4 of an hour to give you the basics. It's a long, complicated project. I could easily expand this to a whole day, but don't worry, I'm not going to talk at you for a whole day. But I want to give you the flavour of it, and there are resources which are mostly free for you to follow up if you want. And then we'll have some questions. Then I'm going to give you some concrete examples of what this might look like in practice. Then we'll have a break. Then you'll think about what ideas you might take forward in your own work. And we've had a bit of a warning about sensitive subjects coming up. Please feel free to kind of look after yourself and take a break if you need to. My other warning is about challenging ideas, which can also leave us feeling uncomfortable. And it's always my aim, my minimum aim for any presentation is to give people things to think about. Viewpoints you maybe hadn't come across before or information you weren't aware of. My aim is not to kind of convert you all to think exactly as I think. Although that's that is an option, of course. That'll keep the question and answer session shorter if you all decide to agree with me. But no joking, this is about us thinking. It's not necessarily about us agreeing. It's about us debating and having ideas and discussions together. So feel very, very free to offer me challenges as well as anything else you might want to give us feedback. So off we go. This is the whiz through the framework. Okay, so it's really important to reiterate this. People's distress is very real. We are not in any way doubting the reality of people's distress. What we are doing is raising questions about the explanations that people are offered. People are very, very often told that your distress is due to an illness of some sort which needs diagnosing, perhaps largely treating with medication. And actually, what we're challenging is that kind of explanation. At the same time, we need to acknowledge we live in a diagnostically based world, although it'd be nice to think of a revolution and a paradigm shift, and I do myself very much believe that's on the way. I think we're all part of it. I think that's what's so exciting. And a lot of what New Script is arguing for, as we will see, is very, very much in line with what the framework is saying. But nevertheless, we're not there yet, so we have to make compromises in everyday life. Of course we do. But we want to offer people, I think, informed choices. You do not have to understand your distress in this particular way. And actually, as we've already noted, the way we currently think about distress is part of the problem. We're reaching this bizarre situation where, according to a study last year, we're nearly all going to be mentally ill at some point in our life if current trends continue. 80% of the Danish population, which is a much more equal and, on the whole, is meant to be one of the happiest societies in Europe, nearly everyone is mentally ill, apparently. And having been diagnosed with a mental illness of some sort, that tends to lead to long-term unemployment, dependence on disability benefits, and so on. What can we say about societies that seem to be driving everyone mad and keeping that way? keeping them that way? I think that's an important question. So here's some signs of the change which is ongoing, which is very exciting. So this is a very recent report which follows on from several other reports in the last few years. It's by the World Health Organization and the United Nations, two very important, powerful bodies. I'm not standing in the way of the screen, am I? No, okay. A fundamental shift is required within the field of mental health, and essentially it's saying there is too much, there is stigma, there's discrimination, there are human rights violations, and they're very clear what the source of the problem is. There is an over-reliance on biomedical approaches to treatment options, inpatient services and care. There is not enough focus on what's the realities of people's lives. Mental health and well-being are strongly associated with social, economic and physical environments, as well as poverty, violence and discrimination. But most mental health systems focus on diagnosis, medication and symptom reduction, neglecting the social determinants. Now, I'm sure this is kind of common sense. We all kind of know this at a gut level, don't we? If we work in services or have received services, well, we may have had some very useful help, but it's at least equally likely that the social determinants, the context of our lives, have not really been focused on. So that's a very fundamental shift being called for. This report came out yesterday, so this is a very up-to-date presentation. It's from an APPG, is a group in the UK Parliament which cuts across different political parties. So it's made up of Tories, Labour, Lib Dems. Anyone else who's interested can join a special interest group about a matter that cuts across political divides. And so this APPG issued this very important report. Again, it aligns very closely with New Script aims. It's saying we need a fundamental shift towards looking about what's happening in people's lives, much less focus on these ideas which are very poorly evidenced about things that are said to go wrong in people's brains that make them so-called mentally ill. So that's important too, backed by a quite unlikely range of politicians, I have to say, including some really kind of hard-right Tories. I'm not a Tory, you probably already guessed that. But, I mean, it's really, really important to get people from all sides of the spectrum on board. That's how things change. And we can all agree about some things, and this is something we are apparently all agreeing on. So, what does the framework have to offer? Well, in a nutshell, the framework is about arguing for narratives, not diagnoses. Instead of labels, diagnoses, attributions of disorder, it's about putting together stories. We are all storytellers and meaning makers. That's a quote from the framework. The framework supports the use of all kinds of narratives or personal stories instead of diagnostic labels. This can help people to create new non-medical hopeful narratives about their lives and circumstances instead of seeing themselves as mentally ill or disordered. Or as the slogan goes, which we didn't invent, it comes from trauma-informed practice, instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. And really important to say this is about all of us. We actually, the framework authors, don't believe in a division between so-called normal and unwell or mentally ill people. We all suffer distress at times. We all struggle in different ways. We all have to find ways of surviving. And we can all construct narratives. That's what we do as human beings. We actually don't have to wait many years on a psychologist's waiting list to get something called a formulation. Psychologists in the room will know what a formulation is. Essentially, it's a version of narrative that is quite widely used in services. It's about sitting down with someone and making sense of their life in terms of what's happened to them. I think it's a very, very important and useful thing to do, but I don't think you have to meet a psychologist to do that. And the framework is very much about putting those tools in the hands of ordinary people, and I'm going to show you some examples. So, as Sarah, the second Sarah, has already told us, this is BPS production. It is not an official BPS or DCP document. Not all psychologists like it. Nobody has to read it, agree with it, use it, do anything at all with it. It'd be nice if they didn't feel they had to abuse it and me on Twitter, but anyway, they are unfortunately free to do that too. And it's not a manual of how to do it. It's a very broad set of principles. That's why we're spending the second half of this morning with you experts in your own settings and your own lives, thinking about how might this work in my setting. We are not here to say, you know, inpatient services should run like this or voluntary organisations should run like this. We're here to offer a set of ideas which is bigger than any particular model, which people can, if they're interested and if they want, take forward and adapt. And if any of you do that and want to let us know, we have a growing section on our website about good practice examples, which shows some of the many, many ways in which people are taking these ideas forward. So it's meant to be post-publication, which was 2018. It's meant to be a kind of collaborative exercise, if you like, of a really very wide range of people helping us to take these ideas forward. Not about saying, stop what you're doing already and do this instead, about saying, great if you're doing a lot of this stuff already, which I'm sure all of you in this room are, and could the framework add something to that? So if you visit the website, the main documents are free. They're very long and dense. If you're planning to take 6 months off work with nothing else to do, you can try the main document, which is a mere 440 pages long with a mere 67 pages of references. This is why it took 5 years to produce. It was co-produced with psychologists and survivors, and we wanted to make it as thoroughly embedded in the evidence as it possibly could be. So it's got a massive overview of all the psychological, biological and social evidence about the causes of distress. We wanted to make it not easy to dismiss, if you like, but however, you don't have to read that. The shorter version is at the bottom, the overview. The even shorter version is in this book. You have leaflets on your table. I have 4 copies for lucky people who rush up to the front waving 15 quid at me. So this is the most accessible way in, because this is the nearest thing we have to what might this actually look like in practice for you yourself, perhaps for self-reflection, or for someone you're working with or supporting, either in a professional or a voluntary or other capacity. So that takes you step by step through the framework in terms of using it to create or co-create a new narrative. Okay, so what are these narratives like? Well, we have suggested some core questions which can be used to help construct or co-construct a narrative. Now, they don't have to be used in this order or in these words, and in fact, they're not, strictly speaking, separate questions. They overlap. You can't really start thinking about power without thinking about threat. You can't really start thinking about threat without thinking about meaning. And any construction of a narrative isn't a kind of one-off thing, is it? Like a diagnosis, you have this illness. It's a process of reflecting and coming back and developing it and thinking about new ideas and so on. But nevertheless, we offer this as a possible way of constructing a narrative. Towards the end, I'm going to show you some examples. The first question is, what has happened to you? Or in PTMF terms, how is power operating in your life? How did it affect you? In PTM terms, what kind of threats does this pose? What sense did you make of it? In other words, what is the meaning of these experiences to you? And what did you have to do to survive? In other words, what kind of threat responses are you using? And I'm going to talk you through these questions. You might want to perhaps start with or add, this is very important of course, what are your strengths? How are you currently surviving? What resources do you have? And when you've done all that, you will find that you have constructed a narrative or a story of some kind, which may open up different ways forward. Non-diagnostic ways forward, narratives, not diagnoses. So, what has happened to you? How is power operating in your life? As I said, even if you've got the handout in front of you, don't feel you have to read all this. But in essence, what we've done is to outline a number of different areas in which power operates, which we need to consider as part of any narrative. This isn't necessarily what you come to first, like if you use trauma-informed practice, these are probably some of the more difficult areas that you'd want to approach quite cautiously, but in terms of constructing a narrative, we think at some point it's fundamental to think about power issues, some of which we're used to thinking about, interpersonal power, the various ways people can hurt and neglect and abuse and exclude and shame and discriminate against people, but some of which we're less used to thinking about. So why is power so central in the framework? it's because power is everywhere in our lives, even when we're not aware of it. And actually, this is a very well-evidenced statement. All the major causes of what we call mental health problems involve inequalities of power. We know this, but we don't set up our services as though this is true. We don't train professionals as though this is true. We don't direct funding as though this is true. But actually, poverty, low social status, large differences in wealth and income, child abuse and neglect, gender-based, race-based discrimination, violence, war and conflict, you know all about conflict in this part of the world, all arise from power differences and are all shown absolutely definitively to lead to later forms of, or current forms of distress. It's not surprising, but it's like the truth that we don't explicitly acknowledge. And it is our view that diagnosis, by definition, excludes a consideration of that. As soon as you start saying it's your bipolar disorder or it's your whatever, you have located the problem within an individual and perhaps within their brain or their brain chemistry, and the rest is, fade out. But actually, these are key causal factors. I think I would also want to say that some versions of psychology and psychotherapy are just as individualising. So it's not that we're just opposed to narrow diagnostic explanations. We're opposed to any narrow explanation. Very narrow versions of CBT, for example, sometimes do that, although I know many CBT practitioners who don't practice in a narrow way, but I think it is a risk. So we also wanted to talk about the importance of what we called ideological power, power over language, meaning and perspective. This is a more subtle form of power. It's less obvious. This is about our expectations, our assumptions, our beliefs, which are so deeply held that we're often not even aware that we're holding them, or we're not perhaps aware that there are different ways of seeing ourselves in the world. It just seems like the way things are. And ideological power is also used to discount and invalidate people's experiences. A woman in a domestically violent relationship, for example, being told that it's her fault, or that whatever. You can think of lots of examples, I'm sure. And there are some here, the kind of response to someone as being raped, which at some level is saying she's asked for it. The response to people living in poverty, to imply that they're scrounging off the state, they're not working hard enough, and so on. And we would say the consequences of trauma, telling people they are so-called psychotic or personality disordered or mentally ill, is the same kind of process. It's actually kind of gaslighting people. It's an abuse of power, we would say, because it's imposing a version of reality that is not actually based in evidence and that obscures the context around people. So, although just about every single person I've ever met in my long career in mental health services has been there for very good reasons and for wanting to help people, and good work does go on in mental health systems, on the whole, the function of mental health and criminal justice systems in society, we would say, is to turn social problems into individual ones and diagnose people as mad or bad, or label them as such, which is why, actually, this very paradoxical effect that, we've set up systems which actually seem to be, on the whole, making people worse, not better. Okay. And ideological power is often shaped by gender role stereotypes, so we know this. So some of these messages come down to us through messages about how ought women and girls to behave, how they ought to believe, what they ought to believe, what kind of lives they ought to lead, and so on. Here's a couple of examples. A woman who was diagnosed with postnatal depression. One of the reasons I felt so down was because I had to admit myself I was not a perfect mother. Well, I'm a mother. I wasn't a perfect one. Any mother in the room can identify with that, I'm sure. However you do, a mother's role is in the wrong, permanent guilt. How many people feel guilty at the moment about not being with their kids? Okay, a few. Mine are adults, so I don't feel guilt anymore. It's quite a relief. But actually, where do these messages come from? This is such a common theme in what we call postnatal depression. We have impossible messages about how motherhood should be, how mothers should be, and which largely lets society as a whole, and sometimes dads and fathers, off the hook. So it's not surprising that people often feel very despairing and hopeless. And conversely, A more typical picture for men is to end up in the criminal justice system, perhaps as a result of all sorts of pressures, some of which we're going to talk about. I'm going to show you an example later of some of the pressures that tend to particularly impact on men through gender role stereotypes. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of ideological power. I think this is quite a good one. Just looking anxiously at my watch because I never have enough time to say everything I want to say. Okay, this is from a UK. Do you get the Daily Mail over here? Yes. Yeah. It's not my favourite paper, but however, this was an interesting article. Why are so many clever, privileged teenage girls on antidepressants? So the story is Ella is slim, attractive, and a gifted dancer with hopes of studying drama at university. There's kind of ideological messages just in that sentence, aren't there? What more could any girl possibly want than to be slim and attractive? Anyway, she comes from a secure, loving family, professional parents, 2 siblings, but she's made 2 attempts to end her life. She's been on medication for depression, she's tried therapy, none of it's worked. She couldn't free herself from thoughts that she'd never be pretty enough or popular enough or clever enough. The pressure of trying to keep up with everyone else never stops. I never feel good enough. She goes on Instagram, compares herself negatively with her friends. And Ella's mother said, Ella said she hates herself, and I don't know why. There's nothing wrong with her. She's beautiful and wonderful, which I'm sure is true. So I think the framework can help us to go beyond what is usually seen as trauma-informed practice, where there's an identifiable trauma of some sort. Now, clearly, Ella is in many ways a fortunate young woman who hasn't had identifiable traumas in her life, but she's felt desperate enough to want to kill herself. And I think she's not unusual in young girls and young boys feeling like this. We have a whole generation of young people feeling really, really very bad about themselves. And you can see why. You can see where she's getting the ideological messages from, a lot of them through social media. And if we had a bit more time, we could think very briefly about the number of people and businesses and organisations that are making money out of Ella, the makeup business and the media platforms and so on. The end result is she's offered 2 what I would see quite individualistic approaches. Well, take the pills haven't worked. I suspect she would offer rather a narrow version of, challenge your thought that you're not good enough. Well, that wasn't nearly powerful enough, evidently, to challenge, the many, many messages coming from all around her. We actually need something more to kind of group in a social level, don't we, for our young people to look about where these messages are coming from. Okay, so how did it affect you? I won't go through this, but obviously power abuses can affect various areas of your life, which include those, and they include things like your value base and your meaning making, your ability to make your sense of your life in a way that is meaningful and helpful to you. What sense did you make of it? This thread of meaning, of course, runs through any narrative. Any narrative is essentially about constructing or co-constructing meaning, and we all do this. But in the framework, we very much emphasise that meaning is both made and found. It doesn't just arise from within us. It's, Ella's belief that she was kind of useless and a failure didn't just come from some malfunctioning cognition in her head, did it? It came from all around her. So the meanings we construct are partly, they always have an individual flavour, but they're never simply arising within our head. This is going back to power again. The meanings that create draw on common understandings about what it is to be a good mother, the woman with so-called postnatal depression, what it is to be a successful young woman, Ella, what it is to be a happy family, what it is to be a refugee, what it means to be mentally ill, and so on. And these, in turn, are based on ideological meanings and assumptions, which very often work to the advantage of people in society who are already more privileged and to the disadvantage of people who are less privileged. If I can mention a painful subject that begins with B, Brexit. I mean, let's not dwell on this, but if ever there was an ideologically driven project, that was it, wasn't it? Sold to us by lies. A small number of people have made a very great amount of money and benefit from it. A much larger number of people are suffering, and of course it's had a particularly damaging impact in this part of the world. Okay. What do you have to do to survive? This covers the area of what we might traditionally think of as symptoms, but in PTM framework language, but also in the language of trauma-informed practice, these are not symptoms. They are threat responses or survival responses. They're things we have to do to survive. And of course, they include our bodies as well as our minds. This isn't just about our heads, it's about all the large body of evidence that we now have, which show that difficult events impact on our bodies as well as on our minds, but not in a kind of simplistic, your chemical imbalance causes your depression way. Rather, in the framework, we have a phrase that says our bodies, our biology, mediates and enables, but does not, in any simple sense, cause our distress. If that makes sense. So I could say, the reason I'm standing here today is because partly my body, my biology. I couldn't stand here today and talk to you if I didn't have a body to get on a plane and come here and a voice to speak and so on. But my body is not in any simple sense causing me to give this talk. It's mediating and enabling the experience I'm having today and the actions I'm partaking in and so on. Same with distress. So no simplistic biological, medical type explanations. So we have a range of threat responses that we can use, and the ones at the top are ones that are probably less under our conscious control. It's very difficult to control the impulse to fight or flight or flee. But as we move further down, we come to ways of coping that may be experienced as more under our conscious control. You know, it's not something about our brain chemistry that drives us to go and buy a bottle of vodka if we're feeling desperate and drink that. To some extent it's under our control, but it's also dependent on the social circumstances you're in and so on. And right down at the bottom I've put two of my most common threat responses, which no one's going to lock me up and diagnose me and medicate me for because they're socially valued: overwork and perfectionism. I mean, that's very much me, and it's not healthy. And I know that when I'm feeling a bit out of control in life, I'm quite likely to do something unhealthy, like sit in front of the computers for 6 hours. It has some benefits, of course. It's not actually a good way of responding to life, but, you know, hey, we all have our survival responses. So what we're saying is that this is not as simple as all symptoms are actually threat responses. It's like saying a whole range of things can be threat responses. So a core aspect of the framework, a core intention is to restore the link between threats and threat responses. So instead of saying, oh, you have panic attacks, or oh, you have depression, or oh, you have mood swings, by the time you get to this point in the story, it should be absolutely obvious that because of the difficult situations you're living in and struggling to survive, and because of the meanings you've made of it, it's not surprising and actually makes a lot of sense and may, at the time, certainly have been very helpful that you do this, this, or this. So this is where psychiatric practice kind of severs that link. As soon as we say, as I said, it's your psychosis or it's your depression, we stop thinking about why and for what reasons are you, at some level, using these responses. And it's a kind of odd thing, because at some level it seems to me this is common sense. If you ask any person in the street, do you think people living in poverty are more likely to be depressed and miserable? And they would say, well, yes, of course they would be. And yet as soon as we know that, then as a society we start talking about an epidemic of depression. You know, I think it's, we were talking about this last night, that suicide rates are much higher in deprived communities in Belfast. Hardly surprising, is it? But then we don't necessarily have strategies that acknowledge that those people are feeling desperate for very good reasons. So we separate the threat from the threat response. And to some extent that's understandable. If you work in services, you know that the way people present is often very confused and overwhelming, and lots of things may have happened at lots of different times, and people may not be able to disclose everything that's happened to them, and so on. It's not always easy to make those links, but actually I think it's part of our job as professionals, if we are professionals, to make those links, even if it takes weeks, months, sometimes years. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of disconnecting threats and threat responses. There were lots of these kind of papers appearing, articles in the press. mental health services apparently needed to be primed to deal with a tsunami of cases, a tidal wave of mental health cases after lockdown, said lots of papers in 2020. If you unpick that, what you find out is that those who are most at risk from what were called this wave of mental health problems were people who had most to struggle with. They were burnt out frontline workers, they were school children who were locked up in homes and couldn't see their friends, they were elderly people who were isolated, they were people trapped in abusive partnerships, there were people who'd lost their jobs and were financially very insecure, and most notably, almost all minority ethnic groups had higher risks of dying from COVID-19 than the white British majority of a comparable age. So actually what we saw, what COVID exposed, was the horrendous degree of inequality in our societies, and the people who had most to suffer, who were, had most to struggle with already, not surprisingly found it harder to cope. And I saw a lot of very, I would say, self-interested jumping on this bandwagon by psychiatrists, by psychologists. Well, we'd infinite number of more mental health professionals and clinics and pills and God knows what else. And of course, services are always under-resourced, but actually it seemed to me this was a particularly clear example of disconnecting threats and threat responses. We had an opportunity to learn from this, to create a more equal society, and we certainly, in England, didn't do that. To put it another way, this is an article I wrote saying, in ordinary language, people with more to be exhausted, depressed and anxious about are feeling more exhausted, depressed and anxious. But it is not a pandemic of mental health problems we need to fear, but a pandemic of mental health thinking. Okay, in the framework, we're very, very keen of translating jargon language, medical language, diagnostic language back into ordinary language. If you start by saying, someone says to you, I have an anxiety disorder, there's not a lot you can say except, oh dear, that must be difficult for you. If somebody says, I feel really scared and worried, it inevitably leads to a much more productive conversation about, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that, tell me what that's about, what are you most worried about, what could you do to make that a bit easier for yourself, and so on. So ordinary language, always preferable. Okay, another example. This is a survey in 2022. 1 in 4 17 to 19-year-olds in England had a probable mental health disorder. Sounds bad news, doesn't it? But again, if you look at under the headlines, those young people are more likely to have been bullied, feel unsafe in school, lack friends, be worried about exams, living in a family that couldn't afford to feed them or pay the rent or keep the house warm. So we're talking about young people with a great many very difficult real experiences, personal and social, to struggle with. What help is it to say, come in and say, oh, as well as all these difficult circumstances, you now have a mental health disorder, and possibly enrol you on the school mindfulness programme? I mean, I'm not opposed to mindfulness and I practice it myself sometimes, but actually, depending on how you frame it, the message can be, well, you have to, the problem is somehow within you not coping, it's not surprising that you feel this way. I don't think it's helpful to start telling young people they have mental disorders when they have very good reasons for feeling the way they do. I looked at your mental health policy 21 to 31 last night, and I have to say, although there's a lot of good stuff in it, I saw quite a lot of disconnecting threats from threat responses. And what's the answer? More clinics, more services, more funding. Well, for what? More professionals. Well, to do what? Do you know what I mean? Some figures about high levels of deprivation. Okay, so where's the focus on that? Anyway, I may say this afternoon at our meeting at Stormont. Okay, so final example. So this comes from this yellow book. There are lots of examples of people who took the framework and used it. I'll do this rather briefly. Anyway, this is a young man called Danny Whitaker who decided to set up his own workshop. At the age of 23, worked round the clock to renovate a building, but it was the time of the economic crash in 2008. Everything conspired against him. His credit was withdrawn. His nightclub collapsed. He descended into anxiety that left him housebound and started punishing himself. He felt he is a complete failure. I could not forgive myself for what he perceived as a humiliating personal failure. And this is an extract from the book where I have commented there's nothing wrong with working hard to achieve, but when this message chimes so closely with wider messages about resilience, aspiration, and pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, when the odds are stacked against you, you are set up to fall into self-punishment and self-blame. And Danny himself said, the framework forced me to take seriously the possibility that what I considered wholesale personal failures that I brought on myself due to incompetence were probably better understood as circumstances forced on me over which I had no control. I discovered my guilt struggled to persist under proper scrutiny. So again, a wider narrative, that includes those kind of social pressures can be quite liberating and freeing for people. Okay, actually I wasn't going to show you that. I'm going to show you this. Okay, so we've talked a lot about narratives and co-constructing stories. There's an aspect of the framework I just want to touch on very, very briefly, which is about our attempt to construct meta-narratives, if you like. I've talked a lot about individual narratives, but really, in principle, those questions apply to narratives at any level, family level, level of a whole society or a whole culture. As we've already discussed, some of the narratives we've talked about, Ella's and Danny's and so on, they were kind of part of bigger narratives in society, aren't they? You can see that. Bigger narratives about how young girls should be, how women should be, how men should be, and so on. And so we've made an attempt to put together these bigger narratives, and we've called them patterns. This is an example of one of our more recent patterns. It's on the website, and it's called Surviving Poverty, and the narratives are in the same version. The general patterns are in the same version as the individual narratives. They think about power, threat, meaning, and threat response. And there's a kind of summary, a story at the end. This is only a tiny extract. And it won't surprise you to hear, but we think it's useful to have this spelled out. And these patterns are based on a great deal of evidence that in talking about power, lack of economic power affects almost every aspect of your life. It creates threats to almost every aspect of your life. It may create meanings like feeling overwhelmed, shamed, humiliated, defeated and trapped. And people may use all kinds of threat responses like alcohol, drugs, like feeling very anxious, like finding it hard to concentrate and so on. So the idea is that this is a kind of replacement for the patterns that we are told fit in traditional psychiatric practice, and we're always told we're on the verge of finding out the evidence to support that. There's going to be a pattern, a medical pattern, that shows that this kind of genetic flaw leads to this kind of manifestation of psychosis or whatever. We've dropped the chemical imbalance finally, after only 40 years of promoting it, knowing it was false. Have you come across that? It's been comprehensively refuted by a colleague of mine, Joanna Moncrief. But we have new bizarre ideas on the way. I think the latest one is neural circuits. Well, neural circuits in the brain are to do with anything. I don't see how far that's going to get us. Anyway, we've been sold these medical patterns. We're going to find the gene or the set of genes that leads to this kind of mental disorder. And we set ourselves the task in the framework of thinking, well, if we want a very different kind of pattern, what would that look like? And this was our answer. Essentially, what it is a pattern that's shaped by meaning, not based on biology. It's a big conceptual leap, if you like. There are meaning-based patterns all around us that help to shape our individual personal stories and are shaped by them. And so it is possible to draw up general patterns which won't precisely fit any individual, but can we think provide some of the benefits that people say they get from diagnosis, which are things like, I'm glad I'm not alone, and I'm glad that other people feel the same, and so on. Now, those are real benefits, and we wouldn't want to kind of deprive anyone of those benefits, but we would say they're based on an unscientific category that has significant disadvantages as well. Whereas if you can show someone a pattern, someone like Danny, this is such a common experience, there's actually a pattern that describes it, then that could be a different way of gaining the same benefits. There's been some interest in the framework from public health as well, which is, and you can see how these patterns might be helpful towards a public health perspective. You know, public health's a really, really important discipline. It's too often based on unthinking use of diagnostic categories, I think, or, you know, why is there so much knife crime or alcohol use or so on? Well, a pattern like surviving poverty, we hope, would help to show the common sense fact, really, that you can't expect people not to turn to knife crime given certain contexts and certain community pressures. You can't expect people not to turn to alcohol given certain levels of desperation and trappedness. And any public health approach has to start at the top end, not the bottom end, if you like. Has to link the threats with the threat responses, in other words. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about another very important aspect of the framework, which is the consequences of diagnostic approaches for minority ethnic groups and non-Western cultures. So, diagnostic models, like these are the names of the diagnostic models in case anyone's not familiar with them, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the International Classification of Diseases, the great big manuals that now consist of 400 plus ways in which we can all be mentally ill or disordered, and I do mean nearly all of us. But they're inevitably based on the social standards of the white Western culture in which they're produced. So it's largely kind of white senior American men who put this kind of stuff together. But even if it wasn't, even if it's women or people from minority ethnic groups, they are likely to be holding the same set of beliefs and assumptions. So the diagnostic manuals, because they're not based like, you know, identifying diabetes or heart disease, they're not based on medical patterns in the body. They're actually ultimately based on judgments about you shouldn't be thinking or feeling or behaving this way in this situation, and because it's so odd we have to call it a disorder. That's a social judgment. So necessarily they fit even less well outside the westernized cultures in which these categories have been developed. Does that make sense? And we think it's very regrettable that our failed diagnostic models and our, you know, of some benefit but also with significant disadvantages, pharmaceutical solutions are being exported in particularly narrow forms under the movement for global mental health, which is not to say that everything that happens under that banner is unhelpful. I don't think it is. But the core assumptions are certainly unquestioned, and they're about offering this new scientific way of thinking to cultures and countries that aren't lucky enough to have it, and in my view don't need it. So here's a provocative statement. Psychiatrists like Sue and Fernando argue that this is simply another form of colonialism, less obvious but just as damaging as earlier forms. That's a powerful statement, isn't it? And of course it's not as obvious as sending in your army or, you know, doing all the things that the British Empire has such a, sensitive subject, I know. I come from a culture and a country that's been very much at the forefront of colonising other people's countries. This isn't as obvious, and because it's not so obvious, because it's sold through ideological messages, we would say, you know, this Western scientific medicine, incredibly advanced, you need some of this. People actually want it, ask it. You know, people are queuing up to have this stuff. Oddly enough, paradoxically enough, if you look at a lot of indigenous communities and cultures that are not diagnostically based in the way that ours is, you will find that the common ways of understanding distress are narrative-based, like the framework, and are typically done at a group level, you know, your social group, your family group, healing circles, and descriptions of, you know, a narrative that will involve the whole extended family, let's say, and seem to work very well in those settings. So the framework, instead of saying, you know, we are not about exporting the framework, that would be to fall into exactly the same trap, but we are about saying if we had an understanding of distress that was based on something like the principles of the framework, we'd be much more inclined to respect and understand and learn from, and to be honest, not interfere with, ways of expressing and healing distress that, through our westernised eyes, might look very strange, but actually work very well in their context. So I'll just very briefly tell you that one of the exciting things I did after the framework had come out was that I was invited to do a tour of Australia and New Zealand. And in Auckland, in New Zealand, I asked if we could have a 2-day workshop, the first of which would consist of me presenting the framework in my rather westernised PowerPoint-heavy way, and the second would be presented by a number of Māori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, presenting their understanding of distress, which was one of the most fascinating experiences of my life, because, of course, you couldn't have had a bigger contrast. So my day started with a lot of PowerPoint. It was probably rather exhausting to listen to. Everyone was very polite. The second day started with a collective set of songs and thanks, acknowledgement of people's ancestors, and not a presentation, but a kind of, it's like a kind of ongoing conversation between some of the presenters and the audience, weaving stories and reflecting, and each reflection led to another reflection. And the Māori version of understanding, you know, life in general and distress in particular is in terms of their deeply held cultural beliefs and legends about gods, the Sky Father and the Earth Mother and so on, and how they relate, and the conflicts they have, and the achievements they have, and the failures they experience, and so on and so on. So could not be more different. And yet one of the interesting things that emerged from the workshop was that at a very deep level there were some similarities. Both I and the Māori presenters were talking about narratives. We were both in very different vocabularies, talking about power struggles and threat responses. And I met a Māori psychiatrist there who had set up a clinic where you couldn't have this in New Zealand because it's a very enlightened country, unlike the UK. You can actually go to a clinic which is entirely based on Māori understanding. So you go along, you go along with your entire extended family and you sit down and you weave stories together. And this Māori psychiatrist, with whom I later wrote an article, had used the framework as an argument for setting up this clinic. Now, they don't explicitly use the framework in the clinic. They don't need to. They have their own forms of understanding, but nevertheless, it helped her to argue of the necessity of and importance of such a clinic. And she described the framework as a distant cousin with more commonalities than differences, which I thought was rather a lovely phrase. Okay, I've almost finished. Shall I tell you one of my other favourite anecdotes from New Zealand? Do we know what a formulation is in this room? Most of us do. Oh, psychologists like myself sitting down with someone who to co-construct an evidence-based best narrative that we can come up with about the sources of your distress. I was trying to explain this highly westernised concept to this audience, which consisted of a number of Māori people. So after I'd put up all my definitions, a Māori elder in the audience said, so what you're saying is a formulation is when two people are in deep contact and they touch each other's hearts. Oh, I found that so moving at the time. I mean, I haven't seen that definition in any book, but that is so true, isn't it? It's achieving a very deep level of mutual understanding and empathy. So, I did wonder whether I should just stay in New Zealand, because it's... and I'd have been wise to do so, actually, because my visit was shortly followed by the pandemic, so... And, of course, they managed that much better than we did. Anyway, okay, so the framework, the importance of acknowledging going beyond trauma-informed practice, going beyond the more immediate and often very difficult circumstances of our lives to think about the ongoing effects. Now, you know this very well. Histories of colonisation, very relevant to you. Collective transgenerational trauma, loss of identity, culture, heritage and land. All of these things have resonance here, don't they? But they have resonance in many, not most other cultures too, particularly, of course, with indigenous people who, surprise, surprise, across the world have horrendously high levels of alcoholism and what is called mental illness and so on. So, I'm going to talk, just mention trauma-informed practice. Is trauma-informed practice a familiar term to you? So trauma-informed practice is based on the very wide and well-evidenced body of work that suggests that, not surprising, this is kind of common sense, this is kind of research I like, common sense research that confirms all the things I already believed, that traumatic events in your life, past and present, are more likely to lead to distress. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, as I'm sure many of you know. So the framework draws a lot on trauma-informed approaches. As I've indicated, it's kind of goes beyond that as well. And because we generally take the position of nothing is beyond criticism, we have included some criticism of some of the potential limitations of trauma-informed practices. I mean, I'm very much a fan of them and very much in favour of them, but of course they can be implemented in a number of different ways. And in some cases, it seems to me they're still quite tied to diagnostic language. In some cases, there's a risk of focusing too much, I think, on particular difficult things that happen in someone's lives, less of the circumstances around them, which is why in the framework on the whole we use the language of adversity rather than trauma. And as I've also indicated, we need to think about people's very real struggles, even when trauma as such doesn't seem to be relevant. So, we need a different narrative about mental ill health, illness, distress, disorder, or another way of putting it, we need a new script, because storytelling and meaning-making are universal human capacities. The framework validates, provides evidence of the central role of narratives of all kinds as an alternative to diagnosis. Some quotes from the framework: the restorative power of truth-telling, and recovery as reclaiming our experience in order to take back authorship of our own stories. The final quote comes from the Yellow Book. It's from a young woman who found the framework helpful in understanding her own struggles. Liberation is always in part a storytelling process, breaking stories, breaking silences, making new stories. A free person tells her own story. A valued person lives in a society in which her story has a place, which I think is a wonderful quote. And astonishingly, the framework has taken off in a way that we never anticipated as we crawl towards publication day, feeling absolutely exhausted in January 2018, thinking, who on earth is going to ever read a word of this dense document? And there's been interest across the UK, across the world. Anne and the other members of the Power Threat Meaning Framework have contributed to these training events. We have a committee that collates these and responds to them and helps to maintain the website. There are, I think there are now 6 translations, with a 7th on the way. There's an interest from services, but also from a number of other places, which I will show you in a minute. And there's been controversy, which is good, because anything's better than being ignored. So, thank you. So, a few minutes for about 10 minutes.